Welcome to the Grief Show. My name is Travis Swearingen, and I will be your host as I unpack the difficult and very broad topic of grief. I'll be interviewing therapists, widows, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, and so much more. Today's episode features my friend Cecily Gibson as she shares her experience being a marriage and family therapist. We talked through a lot of interesting topics like ambiguous and compounding grief, therapy, and some resources that could be super helpful for a lot of our listeners. I'll make sure to include those links and resources in the show notes for all of you to check out. Thanks for listening, and without further ado, here is Cecily Gibson. Cecily, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Good deal. Well, just for our audience that doesn't know you, can you explain for a bit, for everyone what you do?
Yeah, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, so a counselor, but I specialize in sort of systemic treatment of individuals. So we look at problems and solutions through sort of a systemic lens. But basically, I'm a counselor.
What made you want to get in that field? And before that, what do you mean by treating systemically?
Yeah, so systemically, it's looking at an individual not just in a vacuum, but that they're part of a larger system, a larger whole. They belong to a family, relationships. So we look at problems as kind of existing and occurring within that system. And then we also look at solutions through that too. So instead of looking at the individual and saying, hey, you're the problem, let's fix you, and then putting them back into a system that maybe is not as supportive of these new changes, we more so look at the system and say, let's bring you all in and let's see how this issue was kind of created or what led to it. And then how can we change the entire system to support the new changes? It's like taking a puzzle piece and cutting the shape of it and trying to put it in the same puzzle. It's not going to work.
Sure.
There's going to be pressure from the surrounding puzzle pieces to make that puzzle piece fit back the way that it was supposed to. So instead, we look at changing the shape of the entire puzzle, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay. What made you want to become a marriage and family therapist?
It's always just sort of been who I am. I've always been interested in people's stories, just who they are and what they struggle with, and just being a listener, being a witness to that, and then also being able to offer what I can to get them to a better place.
Gotcha. So from an education standpoint, what goes into becoming a marriage and family therapist?
Yes, you do your bachelor's degree in some sort of, human sciences related field. And then you get a master's degree in marriage and family therapy. Then you do internship hours, and then you get your license. And there's a provision license and then a full license.
Okay. Do marriage and family therapists differ much from actual grief counselors? Is grief counseling even a specific niche or a...
Yeah, it can be. There's different types of counselors with different licenses, but then within those, grief is sort of a specialty that you just kind of, everybody has their own interest and passion and what they're good at. And so, you just kind of pursue more education and experience in that area.
Okay. So from your experience, what has grief been like for you, or what has grief been like for your life, whether it's your experiences with it or the experiences of your clients?
Yeah. So, I lost my grandmother, and she was probably my first, big experience with grief and sort of walking through that. But then once I started practicing, there was a lot of clients who came in who were experiencing grief, typical grief. But then I also noticed that there was a lot of clients who were coming in who were experiencing different types of losses that didn't necessarily fit into a typical grief scenario, or, they were obviously grieving, but they didn't really recognize it as grief, There was people who were coming in and experiencing a really bad breakup, and the way that they were processing and the way that they were just sort of walking through navigating this life post breakup was very, very similar to the way someone would navigate, just a typical loss or a normal loss,
A normal loss being like a death in the
Mm-hmm.
family or
Yeah, or a friend dying or something like that. Yeah, yeah. So I just became interested in really walking alongside those who are grieving and trying to help them make sense of it. And the more that I worked with clients who were grieving, the less I became an expert in it because everybody just grieves so differently. Like in the end, when it all comes down to it, grief is about relationship. And there's thousands of types of relationships, and they're just all so unique and so nuanced. And so it would make sense that the grieving process is the same.
yeah, that's so interesting to me that something that's not related to like somebody dying can even feel the same as actually like losing a family member. Or I guess I've heard it said that like when you get a divorce, for example, that it can actually feel like your spouse has died. I've heard that before. It's just so crazy how those things actually equate.
Yeah, yeah. And I think like some people struggle with those two things equating. I know that if somebody has not walked through ambiguous grief like a divorce, and they've only experienced sort of a familial death in the family, there could almost be this defense like it's not real grief, or you're not going through what I'm going through. But until you walk through it and you experience it and experience really both of them, both types of losses, you realize like, wow, there's actually a lot more in similar, or a lot more in common than there is difference.
Gotcha. So are there? I noticed you called one ambiguous grief.
Mm-hmm.
Are there all kinds of? I mean, obviously there's different kinds of grief, but
Yeah.
are they classified differently? Are they?
Yeah, I mean, throughout sort of mental health research and study, there's been so many clinicians who have sort of happened upon different types of grief and studied them and became interested in them and researched them and then sort of named them. And Pauline Boss was the one who discovered, or not discovered, but kind of really researched and named ambiguous grief. But there's all sorts, like anticipatory grief. Like, if somebody has cancer, terminal cancer, they're going to die. You start to grieve them before they've even passed. There's compounding grief when somebody dies and before you have a chance to really walk through that grief, somebody else dies or there's another really big loss. And so suddenly you're faced with like these two these two losses that you're having to grieve. You have to grieve them separately, but you can't separate them. You can't put one on a shelf for a couple of years until you manage the first grief and walk through that process. You're kind of having to do them concurrently. And a lot of people struggle doing that because it's hard, you know. But yeah, there's all sorts of different types of grief that have been sort of researched and named, and I think that helps people really just understand that, like, or especially give validity to how they're feeling.
Gotcha. So the three that you've kind of been talking about are anticipatory, compounding, and ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I very strongly dealt with anticipatory grief in the months leading to my dad dying.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that I had told several of my friends, like, I think within the next 6 months, my dad's going to die. And I started to prepare myself for that to happen. And so I think that that's definitely something that I went through.
Mm-hmm.
is anticipatory grief. It's definitely not related to just like the death of somebody. Like if you see like your divorce, like a divorce is for sure going to happen. Like, I guess you start grieving that in advance, and does that help you prepare yourself for grief later? What have you seen with that?
It depends. That's going to be the answer for everything because for some people, grieving before a loss helps to soften the blow, right? Like you start to mentally walk through the things that they'll be missing. You start creating a list of the milestones that will be missed. And for some people, it helps to deal with that when the time comes, when the milestone actually is there. For other people, it steals the time that they have left with that person. You're already treating them as if they're gone, and not treating them as if they're still alive. And so it's really sort of an individual journey and whatever is going to help you navigate that.
Crazy. So, if somebody is dealing with anticipatory grief, what are ways that they can start working through that personally to get through that? Like, at what point should they be seeing a therapist for anticipatory grief?
I mean, I think with therapy, it's always, I mean, I'm a little bit biased and I think everybody should be in therapy because everybody would benefit from talking to someone who is outside your situation but deeply invested in helping you navigate it.
Okay.
Talking to family members, especially, when you're sharing the same type of grief. If you and a sibling are both anticipating the same death of your parent,
Sure.
there could be a lot of difference between the way that people grieve. And so sometimes it creates a lot of issue where, one person is saying like, I'm already grieving them being gone. And then their sibling will come at them and say like, I can't believe you're doing that. He's still here, and that can create a wedge in relationships because they're both invested in grieving and invested in this person and have their own unique relationship with them, but they're grieving very, very differently. So sooner rather than later, I guess, is the easy answer.
Sure. It's so interesting to think about how many people are dealing with anticipatory grief and they have no idea they're grieving, because you always associate grieving with like it's kind of this response to the thing that's actually happened versus I'm actually going through grief right before the event occurs too. So I was definitely dealing with anticipatory grief right beforehand, and for me, I took the time to really take in being my dad's son. So whenever I was taking care of him or taking him to go do something, he was fighting so hard to make it and to like get through this whole thing. But in my head, like I knew, I don't think so. I don't think you're gonna make it. And so I was really just kind of drinking that in and just kind of like trying to remember things now. And I was asking him stories or tell me about this thing that happened again, or trying to like hold on to those as much as possible. But at the same time though, I think I was in some ways kind of treating him like he'd already died because I was trying to get ready for when that happened, for whenever I needed to step up and take care of things. So when my mom called me and told me that my dad had passed, it didn't like devastate me at all at first. Like I got up, I put my shoes on, got up to my car, dealt with the police, and then from there went to go and talk to my sister and friends and in person, people that knew him really well. And I handled it. And I did my dad's eulogy. I got everything kind of knocked out and done before I even really felt the weight of that loss. And so I think for me, anticipatory grief was it led me to take way more in, but while also preparing me for him to go.
And just knowing the little I know about you, I think that that's really reflective of your personality too. Whereas I could see somebody else saying, you know what, I need to rest in hope. And I will rest in hope until there is no more hope. There is a flat line on the monitor. Because for them, there might be this idea of like, I've given up, like I've contributed to their death in some way by losing hope
Mm-hmm.
or acknowledging or accepting the fact that they're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really, I think that it's interesting, that it's really based on our personalities and what we're needing in that moment and what we're needing after the death, what we're needing after the loss. But I think, like, anticipatory grief, some people really just need that. They need to mentally walk through, what am I going to miss? What answers do I want so that I can get them now? Because I know I won't be able to get them another time, you know?
Crazy. Um, I'd actually really like to learn more also about compounding grief. So, um, what is that again?
So,
It's
compounding grief is when someone experiences a loss, and before they have time to sort of walk through the journey or the initial, you know, um, the initial brunt of grief, usually the first year or so, there's another loss that happens, and that could be another death. That could be, sort of an ambiguous loss, which, we'll talk about as well. But, you know, you could have, like, let's imagine for a moment that there's a couple who is married, and the husband dies. So the wife is dealing with the death of her husband, but her primary support system is her husband's family, and the way that they're grieving or need to grieve is to sort of cut ties with the daughter-in-law, which is happens sometimes, unfortunately. So not only has she lost her husband, now she's lost her support system, her family. Maybe friends don't come around as much anymore, or maybe she loses her job. So she just has multiple losses that she's trying to work through. She's trying to grieve those losses individually, but she can't because they're all sort of clustered together. Or, like what, with siblings, sometimes with death, like they grieve differently. And so you lose the death, or you experience the death of your family or your parent, but then maybe your siblings are sort of, some of them are just avoidant and don't want to talk about the dead parent. They just want to kind of ignore it. Well, now you've sort of lost that sibling relationship too, right? Or, there's some people that just unfortunately experience like death after death after death in really quick succession and have no time or space to really process any of them. So they just avoid all.
Gotcha. So, what does therapy look like for people that have experienced compounding grief like this? I know it's going to be case by case for everybody, but um, is your approach different if it's death after death, or like death and then the loss of family? Like, how do you approach things differently, and how do you gauge what this person needs?
Yeah. So it's really just examining each loss and holding space for it. We don't want to like shelve any loss. You can't just put the loss of your aunt on a shelf while you're dealing with the loss of your dad, because it's still there. You're still going to think about it. You're still going to miss her and experience that loss and that grief. But it's really giving them permission to focus on one person or one loss at a time, maybe for a day or a couple of days, helping them navigate their different relationships. Your relationship with your, you know, aunt may be very different from your relationship with your father. Might be very different from your relationship with your job that you had before you lost it. So really just helping them navigate sort of what those losses are, what they're missing out on, what's lost now that that person is no longer there. So it might be a session where we just talk about dad, or we talk about both, or we talk about all of them. But really just helping them to feel empowered to navigate all of them instead of avoid them, you know. People who have experienced compounding loss also tend to lump all the deaths together. And that can be hard to do because it's like they're just very different degrees of loss. They require different, I don't know, just different grieving periods or methods. So really helping to sort of sort those out from one another, untangle them, and look at them like individually as individual losses.
Crazy. So for me, I within a calendar year, I lost a relationship that I was in for a super long time. I left my company that I had started in 2014 and came to work for the business that I'm at now. And then I lost my dad, one after the other. So it's like I dealt with grief from knowing that relationship was coming to an end, and then it ended. And then I dealt with grief, that anticipatory grief, knowing that I'm about to leave my company and this is what I built like from the ground up with my partners, and I'm saying goodbye to it. And then I dealt with the anticipatory grief of knowing that my dad's probably not going to make it, and then I dealt with each individual event themselves, and they compounded. That's astounding.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had no idea that like this. I knew there are lots of ways that people grieve, and I guess I knew there were different types of grief, but I guess I never even really anticipated.
I think in our society, just in US culture, we're just very unfamiliar with grief, even though it touches everybody on a daily basis, at least once in their lives, grief is going to affect everybody, but we just don't talk about it, which is, it's great that this podcast exists now. But there's just sort of the stigma around talking about grief and grieving, and we just don't really know how to approach it. I don't know. I think this is just my theory, but I think in US culture and society, we tend to recognize that there's a lot of different cultures and mindsets and personalities, and there's just a lot of difference. And so we're afraid to broach the subject out of fear that we're imposing our own idea of grief. Even though some people still do, there's, if you come from a very religious mindset, or you have a very foundational spiritual belief system, you're going to make sense of death differently than somebody who's an atheist. If you believe it, just sort of your belief system kind of forms the way that you understand grief. And I think that we just give maybe too much space for people to grieve, rather than coming close and saying, like, I know you're walking through grief. I don't know what it looks like for you, but I want to know. Let's talk about it. Instead, we say, I know Travis is grieving. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I'm just going to not bring up his dad ever because I don't want to hurt him. I don't want to make him upset. I'm just going to pretend that it doesn't exist.
Sure. It's not ill intent by
Right.
people for the most part. I just think that it's such an uncomfortable idea. And I've caught myself, like, since my dad's died, I've caught myself doing the same thing. Like, I'll know someone has gone through the loss of a parent or a child or something, and I don't know how to navigate it. And I'm like, man, I thought that I was kind of becoming a little more enlightened on this whole deal. And it's like, I still don't know how to deal with the grief of others.
Yeah.
I had I recorded another episode for the show back on Wednesday with Bailey Dover, and she was explaining about how she lost her baby, and I had no idea how to navigate that conversation.
Yeah.
It's just such a, it's just so crazy how we just get so uncomfortable with this topic that all of us will experience, and it sounds like all of us in some way have experienced this, and maybe not realize it.
Yeah. I think if I were to give one person one piece of advice, it would be to view grief as the loss of a relationship. And that's how you approach it. And you come to someone who's grieving and look at them and say you lost a relationship. And you don't necessarily have to offer words of wisdom. You don't have to move them out of grief. You don't have to try and make them happy. You don't have to offer some sort of profound idea of where they are right now, or that there's a larger purpose or anything like that. You just have to approach them knowing that they lost a relationship and talk to them about what that means. What does that relationship mean to them? Who is that person to them? Asking them, tell me about your daughter. Tell me about your dad. Tell me about your friend. Tell me about your dog. Even people who experience divorce, even in really abusive relationships, there's still a relationship that was lost. And people, I think, want to talk about that.
That's such a good way to put that. It's the loss of a relationship. It's so simple, but it really encapsulates kind of all of it.
Right.
Like I I lost a relationship with my significant other. I lost, like when I left my company, I lost my relationship with my business partners. I lost my relationship with my dad when he passed. That's such a good way to kind of summarize what grief is. It really is the loss of a relationship.
Yeah. And sometimes that's not even like a personal relationship. Sometimes it can be a relationship with your identity. Like there's a young man that I worked with who his whole life was football, and he came from small town, top athlete there, came to college, played college ball, got injured, couldn't play football anymore. And so he lost his relationship with the identity of being a football player, and we had to navigate the really difficult grieving process for him to grieve. I am no longer this person anymore. It's no longer a part of who I am. I didn't have control over the loss of it. So it's just like, it's a loss of relationship, and it could be a person, it could be a thing, it could be an identity, it could be, for some people, a loss of a potential relationship. Like if, let's say that I was estranged from my mother who gave me up for adoption, and before I met her, she died. I can still grieve her because I'm grieving the loss of a potential relationship with her.
Interesting. You listed off another type of grief that I think would be really interesting to go into, ambiguous grief. What is that?
So ambiguous grief is essentially it's not tied to a typical grief. And I hate using the word typical, but that's just sort of what it's used, or what it's phrased as. But ambiguous grief is really just the loss of, sometimes it could be a loss of a person who is still alive. Pauline Boss has two types. The first type is a physical absence with a psychological presence. To these people, who are maybe a child who's been kidnapped. The parents don't know for sure that they've died. They still, hold out hope that they're still alive, but they're physically not there. There's like natural disasters, just like the apartment complex in Florida. There's still so many people that are missing. So sort of psychologically they're still alive, but physically they're gone. A divorce would fall under that category. And the second one is opposite, and that's the psychological absence with a physical presence. And so that can be your grandmother who's experiencing dementia, where she's there, but she's not there. Okay. My when my grandmother passed, very shortly after, I say that my grandfather passed because who he is right now is no longer who he's always been. He's just sort of a shell of his former self. And so a lot of my family, unfortunately, has experienced this ambiguous loss with him, where so much of who he is gone. He's physically there, but his personality is different, or just his light has dimmed quite a bit after losing my grandmother. People who have family members who are addicted to substances, or they're physically there, they're just not themselves anymore. So according to Pauline Boss, that those are sort of what she defines as ambiguous loss. There's other clinicians who look at ambiguous loss as being just a loss that doesn't fit the typical mold, so loss of relationship. We talked about earlier, in an example that you have siblings who are grieving very differently. And they used to be very close, but now that they look at each other, they can't access that same relationship without looking through the grief of a parent and looking at each other and saying, you're grieving wrong. You're doing it wrong. You're not giving them the honor or whatever judgment you have, So there's that loss of relationship that's kind of a secondary loss, but it's tied to the grief, or it's tied to the death of a parent, but it's a loss in and of itself.
Interesting. Wow. So if you were to give, like, surely there's somebody that's listening to this that's going, okay, I'm dealing with some kind of grief, whether it's anticipatory, compounding, ambiguous grief, or kind of like we're talking like your typical grief, like you've lost a family member. What resources would you recommend for someone that's kind of discovered this about themselves, or that they realize they're going through it? What resources do you think would be great for them?
Well, I think the first thing that's really important is that you recognize that you are grieving, and you give yourself permission to call it grief. You grieving the loss of a marriage in no way takes away from someone grieving the loss of a child. Okay. You can have your own grief experience. And I think that a lot of people are hesitant to use the word grief because it feels like they're taking that away from someone who has a larger loss, right? And even with typical losses, there's a tendency to say, like, oh, well, I lost my grandmother. She was 90. She lived a good life. It's not as bad as losing a child or losing a parent who's very young. I think that it's okay for everybody to have their own grief, and it doesn't take away from somebody else's grief or minimize it at all. So people who may be listening and feel like, man, I feel like I'm walking through anticipatory grief right now, just giving themselves permission to call it grief and say that they're grieving. And there's tons of resources online. Not all of them are great, but most of them are. One of my favorite websites is whatsyourgrief.com.
Whatsyourgrief.com?
They have some really solid resources, articles. They kind of walk through different types of grief. They have a really good social media presence that's been helpful for a lot of my clients. And it's just really depending on the person, sort of what resource is going to be best for them. A lot of, or some people prefer to sort of grieve alone, or walk through that in a really isolated way. And so in the comfort of your own home, reading books on grief or articles or things like that. Some people really like having someone else to talk to about it. So like I said before, I, am biased, and I'm an advocate for therapy and counseling, just because I feel like it's so helpful for someone to be outside of your situation, but to also deeply care about you and to help walk with you through that. I think that when we turn to friends or family to process our feelings, they care too much about us that they want to take our pain away quickly. Sure. I've had so many people who come in just upset because their family member told them something that was well-intentioned, well-meaning, sure, and it just hit them the wrong way. Right. And it makes them angry, and like they don't want to be angry. But I think that people so badly want to just like move you out of grief, move you out of sadness, because they care about you. So sometimes they're the worst people to talk to and process your feelings with. And most of the time they're experiencing the same loss, but in a different way. And so they're going to be sharing with you what they think you should be doing, whereas a counselor can help you navigate how you're feeling without steering you in a specific direction. They care about you walking through it and not moving past it, if that makes sense. A big goal for me is to really just help my clients take like one step every day. And if we take 15 steps back, then that's okay. It's not sort of this upwards trajectory with no backsliding. It's a roller coaster of like, I have really good days, I have really bad days. I've had really good years, and on year 15, it just hit me like a ton of bricks, and really normalizing that journey for them. And I don't know, therapy is, I think, just always helpful to just sort of sort things out. You can do it on your own, but I think it's just helpful to have somebody else who is walking alongside that and offering help where they can.
Gotcha. So what advice for people that might be on the fence about going to therapy or not going to therapy would you have for them? Like, if they're just trying to decide, like, okay, I know that I'm going through some stuff, and I might need to talk about this with somebody, but I'm kind of fine too. What advice do you have for them?
I think that there's no commitment. You don't have to start and sign a contract to be in therapy for 6 years. You can go and you can try it out. You can try out a couple different counselors. And if it just doesn't fit right for you, you don't have to go back. There's hardly any consequence of you going and talking to a stranger about what you're going through. And so I would just say try it. And if you don't like it, you don't like it. If it's not for you, it's not for you. But I think that it's always helpful that we have somebody that we can sort of talk to. I think a lot of people think that it's like a hard commitment, that you go every week, you go for years. And that's just not the case, depending on your sort of situation and your clinician. I typically have people come in, and if they're high crisis, then we maybe meet for every week for a while. And then once they start to sort of level out, maybe we'll meet every other week, or just have larger breaks in between sessions, so that they can sort of process things on their own over a larger period of time.
Okay. Earlier, you kind of mentioned that there's a lot of really great resources online, but not all of them are great. I'm sure the same must apply for a lot of therapists and counselors. So, on top of making the decision to go, how can I find a quality counselor to help me through my grief?
That's a great question. um, I think it depends on a lot of different things. I mean, there's resources online. Psychologytoday.com is a really good resource to find a therapist near you, and you can sort by a variety of filters. If you really feel like you'd like to meet with a male therapist, you can sort by male therapist. If you really want someone who specializes in grief, you can do that. There's, if there's if your faith is a really important tenet for you, then going to someone who shares the same faith and is a counselor of that same faith might be really important, because they're going to help you navigate your grief process while tying in your faith. A lot of clinicians can do that without specializing in that, but if you feel like, hey, I'm a Christian and I would feel most comfortable with another Christian counselor, then you can sort by Christian counselors. And I think it's really just going and trying it out, and always having the freedom to say, you know what, you're just not a great fit for me, or our personalities are not jiving, and you can always find someone else. But on Psychology Today, there's little bios with pictures, and they tell you what they specialize in. And that's really helpful, I think, for a lot of people to sort of narrow down the search.
Sure.
And then also asking other people that, have gone to grief counselors, and who they'd recommend and why. And I think the why is important because, just like everybody grieves differently, walking through grief counseling with a counselor is going to look very different from person to person, clinician to clinician.
Gotcha. Very cool. I have one last question for you, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with my previous interview that I did the other day. I'm struggling so hard to figure out where I fit in with this conversation and with this podcast. What advice do you have for me as I go and talk to all these different grieving people that are going through so many different scenarios of loss and all the messiness? Like, what advice do you have for me in terms of my involvement with the conversation?
I think my advice for you would be similar advice that I'd give to anybody, is that your main role should be to be a witness. And you just sit there and you're a witness to the loss, and you ask about it, and you help facilitate that conversation so that your listeners can also be a witness to that loss. That you enter into every interview with somebody and say, I know you've lost a relationship. Tell me about it. That you don't have to offer advice. You don't have to fix anything. All you have to do is be a witness to that.
Gotcha. Well, I think we're out of time for today, as you counselors like to say. Yeah?
Yeah. The lights start dimming.
Awesome. Well, you were great. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was extremely insightful. All the different types of grief that you explained, I think was really insightful, and I really do appreciate your advice. I hope that this podcast has been helpful for somebody today. Some of the resources that Cecily brought up like Psychology Today to Find a Counselor, what'syourgrief.com. Check out those resources and let us know how these have helped you or if you've pursued these at all. Stay tuned for more episodes of The Grief Show coming at you every single week. Thanks, guys. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of The Grief Show. If you'd like to join a group of people that are interested in talking about grief, we would love to have you in the Grief Show community. All you have to do is search for the Grief Show community on Facebook and request access. It's a private group, so we'll let you guys in as soon as possible. We're looking forward to bringing more quality content and relatability to the topic and conversation around grief. Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you soon.